Hello and welcome to the fourth instalment of George's Marvellous Medicine. If you remember, we've left it where Granny is sticking out of the roof and George, in an effort to try and prove that he had made the medicine that made Granny really, really tall, he gave some to the chicken, which grew enormous too. Do you remember? So, the next chapter is called The Pig, the Bullocks, the Sheep, the Pony and the Nanny Goat. At the moment, George's mother came back from the shopping in the village. She drove her car into the yard and got out. She was carrying a bottle of milk in one hand and a bag of groceries in the other. The first thing she saw was the gigantic brown hen towering over little George. She dropped the bottle of milk. Then Grandma started shouting at her from the rooftop, and when she looked up and saw Grandma's head sticking up through the tiles, she dropped the bag of groceries. Can you see? Here's the milk and the groceries.
How about that then, Mary? Grandma shouted. I bet you've never seen a hen as big as that. That's George's giant hen, that is.
But, stammered George's mother.
It's George's magic medicine, Grandma shouted. We're both of us at it. The hen and I.
But how in the world did you get up on the roof? Cried the mother.
I didn't, cackled the old woman. My feet are still on the floor in the living room.
This was too much for George's mother to understand. She just goggled and gaped. She looked as though she was going to faint. A second later, George's father appeared. His name was Mr. Killiecrankie. Mr. Cranky was a small man with bandy legs and a huge head. He was a kind father to George, but he was not an easy person to live with because even the smallest thing got him all worked up and excited. The hen standing in the yard was certainly not a small thing, and when Mr. Cranky saw it, he'd started jumping about as though something was burning his feet.
Great heavens, he cried, waving his arms. What's this? What's happened? Where did it come from? It's a giant hen. Who did it?
I did, George said.
Look at me, Grandma shouted from the rooftop. Never mind about the hen. What about me?
Mr. Cranky looked up and saw Grandma.
Shut up, Grandma, he said.
It didn't seem to surprise him that the old girl was sticking up through the roof. It was the hen that excited him. He'd never seen anything like it. But then, who had?
It's fantastic, Mr. Cranky shouted, dancing around the round. It's colossal. It's gigantic. It's tremendous. It's a miracle. How did you do it, George?
George started telling his father about the magic medicine. While he was doing this, the big brown hen sat down in the middle of the yard and went cluck, 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 cluck. Everyone stared at it. When it stood up again, there was a brown egg lying there. The egg was the size of a football.
The egg would make scrambled eggs for 20 people, Mr. Cranky said. George, Mr. Cranky shouted, how much of this medicine have you got?
Lots, George said.
There's a big saucepanful in the kitchen, and this bottle's here nearly full.
Come with me, Mr. Cranky yelled, grabbing George by the arm. Bring the medicine. For years and years I've been trying to breed bigger and bigger animals. Bigger bulls for beef, bigger pigs for pork, bigger sheep for mutton. They went to the pigsty first. George gave a spoonful of medicine to the pig. The pig blew smoke from its nose and jumped about all over the place. Then it grew and grew, and it ended up looking like this. I don't think you can see that particularly clearly, can you? See if I move it a bit closer, is it any better? There we go. So you see Mr. Cranky and George peering over the wall. Sorry about the picture, it's not particularly clear there, is it? There we go, put that back there. They went in to herd the fine black bullocks that Mr. Cranky was trying to fatten for the market. George gave each of them some medicine, and this is what happened. Again, similar if we look. Here's George and Mr. Cranky, and as you move out, look how big they are. They're enormous. Then the sheep. I'll keep it here, look. Wrong way. Here we go, look. So here's George and Mr. Cranky. And if I move back, look how big the sheep are. They're enormous. Let me put that back up there. So we can see the animals are getting bigger. Let's go on to the next one. He gave some to his great pony, Jack Frost. Again, it's massive. You can see a horse here and it's towering over George. And finally, just for fun, he gave some to Alma, the nanny goat, which, unsurprisingly, grew enormous too. Next chapter. We can see George is down here, all tiny. Next chapter. Crane for Grandma. Grandma, from high up on the rooftop, could see everything that was going on, and she didn't like it. She wanted to be the centre of attention, and nobody was taking the slightest notice of her. George and Mr. Cranky were running around and getting excited about the enormous animals. Mrs. Cranky was washing up in the kitchen, and Grandma was all alone on the rooftop. "Hey, you!" she yelled. "George! Get me a cup of tea this minute, you idle little beast!" "Don't listen to the old goat," Mr. Cranky said. "She's stuck where she is, and good thing too." "But we can't leave her up there, Dad," George said. "What if it rains?" "George!" Grandma yelled. "Oh, you horrible little boy! You disgusting little worm! Fetch me a cup of tea at once and a slice of currant cake." "We'll have to get her out, Dad," George said. "She won't give up any of the peace if we don't." Mrs. Cranky came outside and she agreed with George. "She's my own mother," she said. "She's a pain in the neck," Mr. Cranky said. "I don't care," Mrs. Cranky said. "I'm not leaving my own mother sticking up through the roof for the rest of her life." So in the end, Mr. Cranky telephoned the crane company and asked them to send their biggest crane out to the house at once. The crane arrived 1 hour later. It was on wheels and there were 2 men inside it. The crane men climbed up onto the roof and put ropes under Grandma's arms. Then she was lifted right up through the roof. Can we see she's been lifted out? In a way, the medicine had done Grandma good. It had not made her any less grumpy or bad-tempered, but it seemed to have cured all her aches and pains, and she was suddenly as frisky as a ferret. As soon as the crane had lowered her to the ground, she ran over to George's huge pony, Jack Frost, and jumped onto its back. This ancient old hag, who was now as tall as a house, then galloped about the farm and the gigantic pony, jumping over trees and sheds and shouting, "Out of my way! Clear the decks! Stand back, all of you miserable midgets, or I'll trample you to death." And other silly things like that. This is my favourite picture. So here, look, this is the roof of George's house, and it jumped right over it. But because Grandma was now much too tall to get back into the house, she had to sleep that night in the hay barn with the mice and the rats. You might not be able to see, so here's some mice and rats just here while she's curled up in the hay. Mr. Cranky's great idea. So the next chapter. The next day, George's father came down to breakfast in a state of greater excitement than ever. "I've been awake all night thinking about it," he cried. "About what?" George asked him. "About your marvellous medicine, of course. We can't stop now, my boy. We must start making more of it at once. More and more and more." The giant saucepan had been completely emptied the day before because there had been so many sheep and pigs and cows and bullocks to be dosed. "But why do we need more, Dad?" George asked. "We've done all our own animals, and we've made Grandma feel as frisky as a ferret, even though she does have to sleep in the barn." "My dear boy," cried Killy Cranky, "we need barrels and barrels of it, tons and tons. Then we'll sell it to every farmer in the world so that all of them can have giant animals. We'll build a marvellous medicine factory and sell the stuff in bottles at £5 a time. We'll become rich, and you'll become famous." "But wait a minute, Dad," George said. "There's no waiting," cried Mr. Cranky, working himself up so much that he put butter in his coffee and milk on his toast. "Don't you understand what this tremendous invention of yours is going to do to the world? Nobody will ever go hungry again." "Why won't they?" asked George. "Because one giant cow gives 50 buckets of milk a day," cried Mr. Cranky, waving his arms. "One giant chicken will make 100 fried chicken dinners, and one giant pig will give you 1,000 pork chops. It's tremendous, my dear boy. It's fantastic. It changes the world."
But wait a minute, Dad, George said again. Don't keep saying wait a minute, shouted Mr. Cranky. There isn't a minute to wait. We must get cracking at once. Do calm down, my dear, Mrs. Cranky said from the other end of the table, and stop putting marmalade on your cornflakes. The heck with my cornflakes, cried Mr. Cranky, leaping up from his chair. Come on, George, let's get going. And the first thing we'll do is to make one more saucepanful as a tester. But, Dad, said little George, the trouble is... There won't be any trouble, my boy, cried Mr. Cranky. How can there possibly be any trouble? All you've got to do is put the same stuff into the saucepan as you did yesterday. And while you're doing it, I'll write down each and every item. That's how we'll get the magic recipe. But, Dad, George said, please listen to me. Why don't you listen to him, Mrs. Cranky said. The boy's trying to tell you something. But Mr. Cranky was too excited to listen to anyone except himself. And then, he cried, when the new mixture is ready, we'll test it out on the old hen just to make absolutely sure we've got it right. And after all, we'll all shout hooray and build the giant factory. But, Dad, come on then. What is it you want to say? I can't possibly remember all the hundreds of things I put into the saucepan to make the medicine, George said. Of course you can, my dear boy, cried Mr. Cranky. I'll help you. I'll jog your memory. You'll get it in the end. See if you don't. Now then, what was the first thing you put in? Let's move this over. I went up to the bathroom first, George said. I used a lot of things in the bathroom and on Mummy's dressing table. Come on then, cried Mr. Killy Cranky. Up we go to the bathroom. When they got there, they found, of course, a whole lot of empty tubes and empty aerosols and empty bottles. That's great, said Mr. Cranky. That tells us exactly what you used. If anything is empty, it means you used it. So Mr. Cranky started making a list of everything that was empty in the bathroom. Then they went to Mrs. Cranky's dressing table. A box of powder, said Mr. Cranky, writing it down. Helga's hair set, flower of turnips perfume. Terrific. This is going to be easy. Where did you go next? To the laundry room, George said. But are you sure you haven't missed anything out up here, Dad? That's up to you, my boy, Mr. Cranky said. Have I? I don't think so, George said. So down they went to the laundry room once again. Mr. Cranky wrote down the names of all the empty bottles and cans. My goodness me, what a mess of stuff you've used, he cried. No wonder it did magic things. Is that the lot? No, Dad, it's not, George said. And he led his father out to the shed where the animal medicines were kept and showed him the 5 big empty bottles up on the shelf. Mr. Cranky wrote down all their names. Anything else? Mr. Cranky asked. Little George scratched his head and thought, but he couldn't remember having anything else in it. Mr. Killicranky leapt into his car and drove down to the village and bought new bottles and tubes and cans of everything on the list. He then went to the vet and got a fresh supply of all the animal medicines George had used. Now show me how you did it, George, he said. Come along, show me exactly how you mixed them all together. And there you can see George and Mr. Cranky with all of the ingredients that George can remember. I wonder, can you think of something really important that perhaps Mr. Cranky and George have forgotten that was really important to go in there? If you can remember, perhaps even write a comment underneath the thing that should be in there. I hope you are enjoying the story, and I will pick up with the next instalment tomorrow. Look forward to seeing you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.